Elon Musk just tweeted yes and amplified or retweeted a post that says, President versus Elon, who wins? My money's on Elon. Trump should be impeached and J.D. Vance should replace him. He also retweets his original post saying Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That is the real reason they have not been made public. Have a nice day, Donald Trump. Again, as a news organization, we have no evidence of that. But Elon Musk, who just spent a lot of time with him, is making that claim against him. Mara Gay brought us to the point that we are, as a country, as a public, as an electorate, dealing with the insecurities and now malignant social media war between two men. Let me show you what Kara Swisher, who's covered Elon Musk since the beginning, had to say by way of explanation. This is an interview for our new podcast, The Best People. It airs on Monday, but we had some of it ready for this conversation. What is Elon Musk's trauma story?
You know, one of the things I used to say to a lot of people I covered, because you could see that, the trauma, obviously lack of therapy. We would have done very well if he had gone to therapy at one point, but he didn't.
Bad person?
No, he wasn't. I will tell. He definitely had problems from the get with stuff around racism. You know, his family history is really quite fraught. And so I think he had a lot of trauma. And then he was, you know, he has obviously autism issues. And he's a creative person who's very deeply enmeshed in science fiction, whether we're in a simulation or not. Very creative.
Do you think he thinks that we're in a simulation?
He told me that as he got more acclaim, as people sucked up to them, as inevitably happens with rich people or famous people, most rich people now, he started to believe his own nonsense and became overly dramatic. At one point, we did an interview where he said, if Tesla doesn't survive, humanity is doomed to me. I think that he started using drugs quite a bit. I think that's been well reported, especially ketamine. And if you've ever taken it, which I did, it's a very disassociative drug.
So you understand the Trump...
Oh, what's he doing with the government? I think he has a thing in his head that he has this narrative in his head that the government is terrible.
So, Teddy, it's probably not as new to you as it was to me. I was in shock about who he was before Trump welcomed him in. And as Mara's alluding to, gave him the keys to the most impactful elements of our government, all of our personal data, the kinds of things that send a message around the world that America isn't all one thing, our soft power levers, the federal workforce that's been traumatized by design. What is this blistering fight with Donald Trump? How is it likely to end?
We're talking at 425. Let's see where things are at 435. I mean,
exactly.
You know, or 445. I mean, the reality is, you know, in kind of conversations today with some people around him, they're not really sure what his plan is. I mean, I can tell you, you know, Elon Musk has been perturbed by, you know, this budget bill, sure, but he's been perturbed by other things that Trump has done and has not gone public in this kind of ballistic way. So what exactly Elon's plan is something that Elon's own friends are asking one another right now. You know, there's like a nervousness and a sadness that it's come to this. You know, I think the reality is he is motivated by stimuli, and he is upset about things that he is seeing online, and he's upset about some of the ways that Trump treated him on the way out, and he is reacting. There is nothing more complicated or sophisticated beyond that. He is upset and has access to his Twitter account and is making that public. I know that sounds very simple, but that's kind of all it is.
I think we learned for the first time today that, or Trump at least said publicly for the first time today, that he asked Musk to leave. Did we know that it was Trump that asked for his exit?
I mean, it is true that Elon Musk was on a 130-day special government employee tenure, which requires people to leave after 130 days or not become special government employees. It is also true that is a distinction that federal bureaucrats have gotten around for a while, and you can do some creative accounting to avoid that. I buy that Musk was kind of wearing his welcome thin. And, you know, clearly Musk also wanted to get back to his companies, as he said very, very publicly. And, that's why this kind of choreographed rollout was so intentional, where, Musk was doing interviews from SpaceX, and he was doing meetings with Tesla investors in a very public way, because he wanted shareholders to know that he cares about his companies. So I believe all these things were true, that it was good for Trump, it was good for Musk. But, now they can both portray this uncoupling as them firing the other.
Let me show you one more thing that Kara Swisher said about the future of Tesla.
And Musk wants to go to Mars, and he's getting that. That's what he wants. And he really does. And that is, to me, his ultimate goal was that. And to get the regulators off his back. It's Tesla in any way. And that's going to help. Tesla's going down right now.
Do you think so?
Oh, yeah.
And it stops being viable?
Well, I always say the planes are covered with the bodies of pioneers. I mean, they were a true pioneer in the space. I think the reason, even though he blames these protests and this and that and his stupid, I mean, he brought this on himself,
Right.
FYI, these protests. So stop blaming the protesters.
Right.
Teddy, is that the sense? I mean, the market certainly seems to agree with Kara Swisher's analysis.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a company that is in a precarious situation, to say the least, right? I mean, what exactly the future of Tesla is? It is such a company that's been so enraptured in kind of current policy fights. I mean, they obviously were apoplectic during the Biden administration, that they weren't getting the love from a Democratic president that they expected to get from EVs, and then they became linked with this president who doesn't really care for EVs, right? And Frank, in fact, was not including EV subsidies in the big, beautiful bill. So, this is a company that is so kind of dependent on federal government policy. It makes sense that Elon would want to influence it, but where exactly does this company go, given that they've now alienated certainly Democratic voters and maybe Republican voters now?
Angela, I want to come back. My favorite thing you've taught me is narrative dominance. It goes away when a Democrat and a Republican are saying the same thing about you. And so I think the power of and I agree with you at this point, these are just words, but the power of the words that Trump is using against Elon, that he's mad because he didn't get his EV subsidy, is not going to help his brand. Not going to bring anyone back to Tesla, because he destroyed USAID. He seized all of our government data for a tax break. Really? That's not brand enhancing. And on the other side, the narrative dominance relied on nobody piercing Trump's dominance in the bubble. The only person with more dominance in Trump's media ecosystem is actually Elon Musk, who's picking a side. He's picking J.D. Vance, who's as prominent in the fever swamps of right-wing disinformation and conspiracy theories as anyone. And he's not just saying Trump should be impeached. He's saying, and J.D. Vance should be elevated.
Yeah, and I think, I look, Kara Swisher said it when she was trying to describe, at least in part, to help explain and illustrate how Musk got to where he is that he has a narrative inside of his head that he just can't get unstuck, and he's living his life according to that narrative. But where did he get that from? We got red pilled on social media for years, and a lot of that is poisonous, and that gets to the core part of what you're getting to, which is a few things. One, whatever the outcome is over the long term, one of the things, and I really do think the Epstein thing is the most significant thing that Musk has said so far, because what it does is it puts poison into the system. Amongst Trump's base. That is a soft spot for Trump right now, at least amongst his own supporters. They are mad and feel like he's hiding something. And that goes all the way back to that interview a couple weeks ago that Bongino and Kash Patel did, the FBI director and deputy FBI director, when they said, look, Epstein did kill himself. There's no conspiracy here. People online were furious about that. Trump's supporters were mad about that. They turned on Patel and Bongino. It's the same. They want to have an answer. They have a narrative that something really dastardly was done and that there's some shadowy forces covering it up. And the idea that Musk is now linking Trump to those shadowy forces is a very powerful connector to the narrative that a significant portion of his audience has. And there's plenty of other little soft spots too, and he knows where they are. And that's the key here, because if you think about how Trump came to power, that was a big part of how he came to power. He came up and validated a lot of the narrative that a very large part of people believed. And Trump said, yeah, sure, I gave it to both sides, and I didn't pay taxes because I'm smart, and that's what rich people like me do. We screw you. So of course you need to hire me. Fire with fire. I know what's really going on behind the curtain, and I'll expose you all to it. And that's basically what Musk is threatening to do here. Could he ever unseat Trump? No, but what he can do probably is put a lot of poison in the system and take all those fractures and turn them into big fat cracks, and that shouldn't be discounted. And it will shake Trump's support amongst his base. There's no way around that.
The explosion in what is now the clearly, completely broken relationship between President Trump and his largest donor, Elon Musk, who went from lording over cabinet meetings, holding that special goodbye press appearance in the Oval Office. Remember, that was just last week, to a total blowout battle today that is riveting Washington, politics, huge corners of the internet, as I said, both for its messiness, pettiness, but also its stakes. Now, they hit new lows with Musk trying to smear Trump with a horrific conspiracy theory, Trump blasting Musk, and now doing something that should never be normal, whether he's mad at Musk or not, which is blatantly threatening to abuse the federal government to retaliate against him. Meanwhile, Tesla's stock is down today. We'll get into that, which hits Musk where it hurts. What began with the tension earlier this week and Musk lashing out at Trump's top legislative priority, but claiming that it was a policy dispute, has turned petty. As I mentioned to our colleague Nicole, it has turned rap beef level petty and personal. So these two men, again, who have, in one case, businesses to run, in the other case, a country to obviously run, are not exactly acting like mature professionals, to say the least. Today, they have exchanged a volley of threats and vitriol, taunts and attacks. And I'll just say something. Sometimes in the news, we just sort of tell you what we're seeing, and it sounds obvious. So let me put it like this. The exchange between these two men just today is actually far harsher, more negative and nasty than what we've been seeing between the two political parties for the last several weeks or months, which reminds you just how bananas this is. Now, these are two men who claim to be working together towards largely the same agenda or goals as recently as last week. One of them remains a huge player in Republican politics because money matters. Everybody knows that in our American system, where you can donate a lot, unlimited, to super PACs. And he is still on record as the biggest Republican donor from last year. And that PowerPoint is one that Musk cited, as if anyone needs a reminder on the right, telling everyone today that Trump and the GOP would have lost the election last year, wouldn't, he argues, even be in power, and that he thus has leverage over Republicans because of that spending, whether it's the past, which he thinks he's clearly owed for, or the future, where he can spend more than most candidates could ever raise, and it won't affect his bottom line. So that's the big context. Here was the president today.
Look, Elon and I had a great relationship. I don't know if we're well anymore. I was surprised, but I'm very disappointed in Elon. I've helped Elon a lot. People leave my administration and they love us, and then at some point they miss it so badly, and some of them embrace it and some of them actually become hostile. I don't know what it is. It's sort of Trump derangement syndrome, I guess they call it. He hasn't said bad about me personally, but I'm sure that'll be next. And I'll be honest, I think he misses the place. I think he got out there and all of a sudden he wasn't in this beautiful Oval Office. I can understand why he's upset. Remember, he was here for a long time. You saw a man who was very happy when he stood behind the Oval desk, and even with the black eye, I said, "Do you want a little makeup? We'll get you a little makeup." But he said, "No, I don't think so," which is interesting.
Musk has over 200 million followers, many of them in the United States, and a high concentration of them on the right. He also has a site that has been caught since he took it over, boosting the reach of what he says further. So even though we talk to you here through the news and YouTube, if you watch on there, and other people use other platforms, nobody can doubt that the platform of X on the right over the last several months is kind of their home base. And now it has been flipped. Musk undercutting the very Republicans he was working with as powerless without him, and then arguing they show such ingratitude. Remember, this is Elon Musk on the platform he owns in a place where people have saluted or worshipped his wealth and tech acumen. These are not just empty attacks. A lot of people Republicans need for the next election are reading this. Musk's attacks also move even faster than, say, how Democrats have been attacking Donald Trump. I mean, they've made many criticisms, but they have not yet floated impeachment, even over potential grounds like flouting court orders or the violation allegedly of the emoluments clause, right, with taking the foreign jet. But Musk doesn't waste time. He is now, tonight we can report, backing Trump's impeachment. Yes, he says, by reposting that call online. And both these men have used tweets and misinformation in their crusades, but usually together towards their common opponents. Musk now turning those same dirty tricks back on Trump today. And I want to tell you about this news without reinforcing the smear. So I'm not going to repeat it. But Musk is trying to smear his teammate with one of the worst things you can allege about someone, alleging sordid crimes that people throw at opponents. Now, we're not getting into the specifics, and we're not reporting this is at all anything related to truth, just related to how these two men are beefing. And by the way, Mr. Musk should know, pushing that kind of claim without any evidence is the kind of thing that sometimes people sue and file defamation cases over. Again, he has so much money, he may be immune to that type of civil accountability. But what we are witnessing matters because something that once looked all powerful and people wondering how much Musk would get away with his pseudo-government role has now ended. This now brief alliance of alleged MAGA goals, money, and tech is dead. And Trump is admitting he may attempt the same kind of allegedly unlawful retaliation he's used on law firms he doesn't like, now against Musk. Remember, whatever you think of Elon Musk, I will tell you, the president or any politician's political opinion of him should not affect or corrupt his government contracts. Those should obviously be done fairly based on what the government needs. And if NASA needs to work with someone and they do a fair bid, great. It shouldn't come and go with politics. That's the same standards we've mentioned for other issues. Well, here we see it in the Civil War because Trump says he could terminate Musk's government subsidies and contracts. That's how to save money, a dig at the efficiency Musk promised. Musk's net worth has taken a huge hit this year. Those are the contracts, though, that continue to supply part of his empire. And as the spending bill hangs in the balance, Trump, of course, attacked Musk in the press. And now he's announcing something that they didn't say last week. He's claiming he fired Elon Musk. Different storyline. It's also, we should note, what some experts thought accounted for Musk's anger. Republican veteran Bill Kristol actually suggested that just this week. Trump now posting that he was the one who asked Elon to leave because he was wearing thin. Those are fighting words for a billionaire who has not been publicly fired in a very long time. And then, as I told you, here's what another part that matters and that is telling. The president accusing Musk of basically being in all this for himself, that it wasn't about efficiency or helping the American people, but Musk was really mad he couldn't get more money out of the federal government under Trump. Quote, I took away his mandate. It forced everyone to buy electric cars. This is something that Trump basically posted. And then he said it made Musk go crazy, quote, unquote. Now, that's an accusation, of course. As to the electric vehicle credits, well, that would, of course, help Tesla.
Elon's upset because we took the EV mandate, and which was a lot of money for electric vehicles, and they're having a hard time, the electric vehicles, and they want us to pay billions of dollars in subsidy. I'm very disappointed because Elon knew the inner workings of this bill better than almost anybody sitting here. Better than you people. He knew everything about it. He had no problem with it. All of a sudden he had a problem, and he only developed the problem when he found out that we're going to have to cut the EV mandate because that's billions and billions of dollars, and it really is unfair.
Really important point there. Number one, there will continue to be reporting on whether that was a part or big part of why Musk left. Separate from Trump saying it, Axios reported earlier this week that that was a factor, and we'll continue to track that down. But I told you we had the whole rap beef part of this and the petty part of this. This part matters, completely apart from the messiness. I want you to just, hey, we take in the news together. Let's take in the premise the president just shared there that I played for you. Donald Trump is trying to cast himself as a whistleblower for his own administration. That's what he's saying. He's saying, let me tell you what really happened. This guy was just in it for the electric vehicle credits that would so enrich Tesla. But the problem is you can't be a whistleblower on yourself. Certainly not when you're the president and you're in charge. You hired this guy, and if you were so concerned that this was just Tesla enrichment, well, why didn't you blow the whistle and fire him earlier? And the answer makes it even worse. I say this not as criticism, but as facts that make these men look bad. Rich men who still want to take your taxpayer money, if you keep your eyes open and notice it, because we've already seen what they did. Electric vehicle credits, openly trafficking in favors, self-dealing, and the kind of conflicts of interest in crony capitalism which proliferate when you don't have controls or rule of law or, by the way, a strong free press, all the ways that you keep people accountable. Because I'm saying this all to you while you see on your screen with your own eyes what we already know. These two men who are billionaires aren't content to be rich enough. They wanted to take your White House, the people's house, your tax dollars, and our attention to hawk those Teslas.
You got to give him credit.
We want the future to look like the future, and it's kind of what kind of truck would Blade Runner drive?
The one I like is that one. And I want that same color.
You buying a Tesla will boost Tesla sales and boost
Well, I
their
hope
stock?
it does. Look.
Was that your goal
I
by
care
doing
about
this?
one thing. When somebody's a great patriot, they shouldn't be hurt. He's a great patriot. I love Tesla.
He hopes it does. And any conventional system, that is an admission of a problem. The government playing favorites and trying to help their people in the free market. It's something Republicans and conservatives have long said they are against. The goal then was to sell what Trump called that love and make Musk money, which he admitted. Now, that is not okay for the federal government, period. Whether it works or not, it's not okay. If you're watching the news and you say, I've heard about these tremors and inflection points before, I get it. But this is one of the worst Republican conservative crises that Donald Trump has faced in this second term, and he's facing an opponent who is well capitalized and not backing down.
NBC News also reported yesterday that the Trump administration has launched what they are calling Operation at Large. And the plan pulls in 1,800 agents from Homeland Security's investigations unit, 2,000 employees from the FBI, the U.S. Marshal Service, and the DEA, and 250 IRS agents. So thousands of people just reassigned, taken off their normal jobs, and tasked simply with rounding up immigrants to meet Stephen Miller's objectives. And all of those resources being put into immigration means there are less resources for everything else. Federal prosecutors told NBC News that cases without immigration components have been stalled or are moving more slowly. At least one U.S. attorney's office abandoned a potential federal prosecution against someone prosecutors felt was dangerous because the case lacked an immigration component. And last week, ProPublica reported that because the Trump administration wants to focus so much on immigration, they are leaving the fight against extremist violence to the states. As Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel put it, the federal government used to prioritize domestic terrorism. And now it's like domestic terrorism just went away overnight. It certainly did not. To show you how much the Trump administration cares about keeping the country safe, check out who they just appointed to lead the Department of Homeland Security's, one of their hubs for terrorism prevention. This guy. This is 22-year-old Thomas Fugate, who literally graduated from college last year. And according to his LinkedIn, the bulk of his leadership experience comes from his participation in a club that simulates the United Nations. I am not kidding. Nothing wrong with those clubs, but you're not ready to be in charge of a counterterrorism hub a year later. But pivotally, no threat prevention experience is listed in his employment history. So what exactly made Mr. Fugate right for the role? As ProPublica put it in a new piece, Fugate brings a different qualification prized by the White House: loyalty to the president. On Instagram, Mr. Fugate traced his political awakening to 2016, which, by the way, he was 13 years old, where he said, quote, "In a generation deprived of hope, opportunity, and happiness, I saw in one man the capacity for real and lasting change, Donald Trump." Now, just last year, Mr. Fugate spent some time down in Florida celebrating Trump's 78th birthday as part of a fan group called Club 47. People inside DHS said that Mr. Fugate was hired less to run the agency and more as a minder or a babysitter, saying, quote, the White House installed Fugate to oversee a pivot away from traditional counterterrorism lanes and to steer resources toward MAGA-friendly sheriffs and border security projects before eventually shuttering operations. The office's mission has changed overnight, with a pivot away from focusing on domestic extremism, especially far-right movements. The terrorism category that framed the agency's work for years was abruptly expanded to include drug cartels, part of what DHS staffers call an overarching message that border security is the only mission that matters. Meanwhile, we as a country have seen plenty of actual extremist violence recently. I mean, an arson attack on the governor of Pennsylvania's home, a mass shooting at Florida State University, a car bombing at a fertility clinic in California, 2 Israeli embassy aides shot dead outside a Jewish museum in Washington, a firebombing attack in Colorado. All of that happened in just the last 2 months. And now, the guy in charge of one of the offices tasked with preventing extremist violence like that is this 22-year-old. Before he got the position, the previous director was Bill Braniff, an Army veteran with more than 2 decades of national security experience. He resigned long before this, earlier this year, when the Trump administration started gutting the office. And he joins me now. Bill Braniff, thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I think it's so important for people to understand all of the different factions of government, all the things they do. So let me just start by asking you about this office and what exactly the team you used to run is responsible for and how they work with communities.
So I used to be the director of the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, and the key word there is partnerships.
Yeah.
My office partnered with state government officials, local government officials, public health officials, mental health professionals, schools, the law enforcement community, to make sure that we are creating upstream prevention programs. These are programs that can do a non-criminal justice intervention if someone is gravitating towards violence, the way we might do a non-criminal justice intervention if someone was gravitating towards suicide. And these programs had amazing promise. We really demonstrated proof of concept, and I think Americans would be really proud of the work that this very multidisciplinary team was doing in partnership with our local partners.
It's so important for people to understand. I mean, even working in government for myself, I didn't do this, obviously, that prevention and working with local communities is such a pivotal part of what the federal government does around the country. You came to the job with 2 decades of national security experience, which I think was applied in a range of ways. You're working in preventing all sorts of different kinds of violence. How was that applied, and why is having that experience important? Obviously, they've taken a different approach with your successor of sorts.
Sure. I tried on a whole bunch of different roles for size over the years. I served in the Army. I worked in nuclear counterterrorism. I went to grad school. I spent 5 years training the FBI, the CIA, the Special Operations Community, the State Department, and local law enforcement on counterterrorism issues. And along the way, I realized that traditional counterterrorism, while essential, is insufficient, that we needed something else besides responding to already mobilizing violent actors. We needed to figure out how to decrease the number of people who ever got to that point where they wanted to engage in violence. And I started to look around at other professional disciplines. It turns out that our public health community, for over 3 decades, has been taking evidence-based approaches to other forms of violence prevention, whether that's suicide or intimate partner violence prevention, violence against children. And I just said, well, what if we pick up what we've learned from other forms of violence prevention and put it down on this very exotic form of violence that we've said was Homeland Security business, national security business. And it turns out humans are humans and violence is violence, and a lot of those programs really work. So I actually had to do this for 15 years and realize it wasn't working to know to look at another group of professionals to find out what does work.
It's experience really matters. You left back in March. That must have been a really hard decision to make at the time. It's a kind of, you've been working and thinking about how to do this effectively for some time. What was that decision like? And are you still in touch with people who are still working in the program now?
Almost every day, I'm in touch with my colleagues. It was a dream job. It was a brutally difficult job initially. We had to change a culture to adopt this public health informed approach. We had to do a lot of internalizing and professional development as a team. But leaving that organization was gutting for me. We had something really special going, and the traction we were getting across the country with our partners was remarkable. But 8 of my probationary employees were fired wrongfully. They had received an email saying that their performance was lacking, and I can assure you their performance was not lacking. They were extraordinary.
8 of them.
8 over a weekend. And I was also notified that I would not be renewed at the end of my first 2-year tenure. So I knew I was a lame duck. I could sit on my hands for 8 weeks or 6 weeks and hope no one else got fired, or I could resign and protest to tell my 8 probationary employees that they mattered, that their service matters, that they were not people I would, say we should be discarding in that way. And then I went to work at American University. There's a research lab there that really leads the field in this prevention space, and we are working to recreate this government capability outside of government.
Bill Braniff, thank you so much. I've been wanting to talk to you since I read about you in ProPublica over a week ago. I hope you'll come back and talk to us about that and violence prevention. And I think this is an area people should really keep their eye on. So thank you again.
I would love to. Americans should know that violence is preventable, and we can help them prevent it.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome back. A stark new warning from Russia's Vladimir Putin issued via President Trump. In a social media post, President Trump says he spoke with Putin for more than an hour yesterday, and that Putin vowed strong retaliation for the stunning Ukrainian drone assault across multiple locations deep inside Russia this week. New footage released by the Ukrainian Security Service shows more of that attack that devastated some aircraft of Russia's bomber fleet, a surprise assault a whole year and a half in the making. Let's go to NBC's chief international correspondent, Keir Simmons, for the very latest. Keir, where does Putin's retaliation threats leave potential peace negotiations?
Well, that's a great question, and much of it depends on what's in the mind of not President Putin, but President Trump. The political site Axios, citing sources who discussed it with him, say President Trump called those Ukrainian drone strikes badass and strong, but is concerned that those strikes will make a ceasefire harder. So the war continues. And so does a propaganda battle, with Ukraine releasing more details of that attack on Russian bombers, while Russia claiming, clearly falsely from the images, that all the planes can be repaired.
President Trump and President Putin offering their first public reaction as new video emerges of Ukraine's drone attack that devastated some of Russia's deadly long-range bomber fleet. The more than 4 minutes of footage released by the Ukrainian Security Service shows additional Russian aircraft targeted, including what appears to be an A-50 spy plane. After an hour and 15-minute phone call between the two men, Trump saying Putin told him, quote, very strongly, Russia will have to respond. Moscow has launched an onslaught of air attacks in recent weeks. This latest video, the aftermath of a Russian drone and missile attack on Kharkiv in just the last 24 hours. Trump did not say whether he tried to persuade Putin against another deadly offensive. Despite close to 1 million Russian military casualties, 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers, according to a new report, and President Trump's long-standing conviction that Putin was ready to end the war.
I believe Putin wants to do it. And if I thought that President Putin did not want to get this over with, I wouldn't even be talking about it.
Trump said his call with the Russian leader was not a conversation that will immediately lead to peace. That impasse did not prevent them from discussing cooperation on other issues, like Iran nuclear negotiations. Iran's close relations with Russia, along with China and North Korea, has been dubbed an axis of resistance. President Zelensky warning Putin feels impunity and that Russia is, quote, giving the finger to the entire world.
We just have to pressure on him, and maybe we will get peace.
President Zelensky handing out medals. His message, Ukraine can keep fighting.
And now back to that drone strike, top Ukrainian officials insisting that 41 Russian aircraft were destroyed or damaged. So far, visual evidence is not available to confirm that number. The Russian spy plane that you saw there, for example, in the footage, you don't actually see it on fire, but there is other footage which shows Ukraine targeting Russian planes that at that moment are loaded with bombs. Hannah.
All right, Keir Simmons, thank you. Joining us now is Igor Novikov. He's in Kyiv. He's the former advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Igor, it's good to have you with us. Ceasefire negotiations seem to be at a standstill right now. Russia's already stepped up its bombardment of Ukrainian cities, vowing further retaliation after that massive attack. What are the Ukrainian people bracing for to happen next?
Well, I'm pretty sure nothing we haven't seen before, on one hand. On the other hand, obviously, Putin is a bit angry about what happened in the Operation Spiderweb. But unfortunately, that's the only thing we can do. We need to make sure that the cost of this war for Putin is unbearable. And since we don't have as much support as we had from the West, we have to basically use the asymmetrical war tactics.
I mean, it was like something out of a spy thriller, that Operation Spiderweb. How big of a morale boost was that for Ukraine? And I guess conversely, are you worried about setbacks when it comes to reaching a ceasefire?
Well, I don't believe in ceasefire until autumn, to be honest, because Putin is not interested in that. In the conventional warfare, he does have advantage at the moment, hence our asymmetrical attacks. Plus, I don't think President Trump is really helping, because if you analyze what he said, he basically said the operation was badass, so continue doing that. Putin's going to strike in retaliation. Well, nothing I can do about it. But guys, I want peace. I mean, that doesn't work like that.
So we know President Trump and Putin spoke for more than an hour, but President Trump didn't say whether he tried to persuade Putin from retaliating. What do you make of the U.S. involvement at this point?
Well, it's absolutely horrific. I mean, that statement I saw from him on Truth Social, because basically what he's saying is, you know, a dictator just said, I'm going to murder a bunch of civilians, because if anyone's got any doubts, he's going to attack civilians rather than the military targets. You just wait and see. And the president of the United States, you know, the leader of the free world, just said, well, you know, he just told me that. I didn't say anything in return.
Igor Novikov, thanks so much.
Or you will. Yeah.
Thank you for giving us this pulse check from Ukraine and for continuing to provide that insight. We appreciate you.
And then, of course, that other executive order, ordering a wide-ranging investigation into former President Joe Biden and his aides, this latest attack on his political rival. Trump is accusing the aides of covering up Biden's alleged cognitive decline and using the auto pen to sign bills and assert exclusive presidential power, including on pardons, executive orders, and other documents. Trump directed Attorney General Pam Bondi and the White House counsel to lead that investigation. But the move appears to be an effort to possibly pave the way for Republicans to argue that many of Biden's actions as president weren't valid. But let's be clear here. The Justice Department, during administrations under both parties, has recognized the use of auto pen to sign legislation and issue pardons for decades. And Trump presented zero evidence that Biden was unaware of any actions taken in his name. Also, the president's absolute pardon power is enshrined in the Constitution. Biden released a statement, though, on this investigation. It read in part, "Let me be clear. I made the decisions during my presidency. I made the decisions about the pardons, executive orders, legislation, and proclamations. Any suggestion that I didn't is ridiculous and false." With all that, let's bring in White House reporter for Politico, Jake Traylor. Jake, let's just start with all of these new White House actions, the revival of the travel ban, targeting continually Harvard University, and then, of course, Joe Biden. Is this a sign that all of the Musk stuff on Capitol Hill is getting to the White House and the president?
Yeah, Ali, it's a very good question, and it's something that is not completely unprecedented or unsurprising that we see, especially in a Trump administration and a Trump White House. We were looking at a week where there wasn't a lot of good news for Donald Trump, especially when it came to post after post on X from Elon Musk going after this mega bill, creating quite the stir on Capitol Hill and over at the White House. When we have something like this take place, it's not completely uncommon that a lot of times the White House kind of buries some of those other stories all in there at once. All these actions came yesterday evening pretty unprompted, although talking with White House officials after all these announcements and executive orders came out, they said this was in the lineup all along. It is pretty rare that these happened after the actual workday in the evening time, and it felt as though a lot of them had just piled up, kind of sweeping and changing the narrative that had kind of consumed Washington so far this week, which has been Musk's consistent attack of this mega bill.
Yeah, I do think it was striking and interesting, Jake, the fact that Republican senators on the Hill were asked about the resurgence of the travel ban in this new form. And they basically said, oh, well, I don't actually think it's in response to what happened in Boulder, Colorado, even though that's what the White House is saying. Even they said they knew that this was coming at some point.
Yeah, these types of things often happen whenever we see the White House move really quickly. And so the details of that are still parsed out and not entirely clear of the timing of all this. But yeah, we were speaking with officials late last night who, discussing the timing of this, they said exactly what you did, that Boulder was the reason this was amplified and hurried up. When we talked to people on the Hill, they say that's not the case. It reminds me of when the trade minister was in an actual hearing on the Hill whenever tariffs rapidly changed. Yes. And he was asked in real time, did you know that this has changed? And he was not made completely aware. The White House often moves in a very kind of quick, speedy, and sometimes not fully communicative way here. That seems to be the case, and we're going to continue to get a readout on that throughout the day.
Yeah, of course, especially because you're right. These executive orders are typically signed with some kind of press access, even if it's just for the pool. The president likes to talk through these usually. This is different, even though, again, the White House and other people on Capitol Hill are saying, yeah, we had some sense that something like this was coming. Of course, the fact that it comes against this backdrop is notable, of course, Jake, because Elon Musk is ramping up his criticism of President Trump's legislative agenda, calling on senators to kill the bill, like the seminal bill that will do all of their policy items. In a series of social media posts yesterday, the Tesla CEO tried to rally Republicans against the legislation, urging voters to call their senators and congressmen, writing, quote, bankrupting America is not okay. Musk also suggested drafting a new bill that won't add to the national debt. Sure, what? Like it's hard? The comments mark what appears to be an escalation in the rift between Musk and the Trump administration. One senior White House official telling NBC News President Trump is now considering how and when to respond, adding that he was, quote, caught off guard but not entirely surprised by Musk's opposition. Meanwhile, House Speaker Mike Johnson had this to say.
Elon and I left on a great note. We were texting one another, happy texts, Monday. And then yesterday, 24 hours later, he does a 180 and he comes out and opposes the bill. And it surprised me, frankly. I think he's flat wrong. I think he's way off on this, and I've told him as much, and I've said it publicly and privately. I'm very consistent in that. But am I concerned about the effect of this on the midterms? I'm not. Let me tell you why. Because when the big, beautiful bill is done and signed into law, every single American is going to do better.
We're going to watch that theory get tested in real time. Meanwhile, in the upper chamber, some Republican senators are not taking Musk's criticism lightly, asking him to be a little more specific, too.
I can't respond to generalities. If you want to talk about specific provisions in the bill and solutions for it, this is somebody who has got a lot of insight into the U.S. government over the last 6 months. Give us some productive feedback that we can operate on. I can't operate on platitudes, or I can't respond to platitudes.
I wish he'd just say what he thinks. Look, I think Mr. Musk, I'm a big Musk fan. I think he's really smart. I think he's entitled to his opinion. He's frustrated. I think he believes, in my judgment correctly, that we're quickly becoming debt slaves, that Congress needs to re-earn the magical healing power of no. And I agree with him. Having said that, I'm not ready to throw in the towel on this bill.
Interesting comments there, and we're going to hear directly from Senator Kennedy in just a little while when he joins Morning Joe this morning. But a new estimate from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office finds that President Trump's tax and spending bill would do as Musk and others fear: add $2.4 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. The simple math on the bill projects a loss of $3.7 trillion in tax revenue while cutting net spending by $1.3 trillion. The Budget Office also estimated that nearly 11 million people would lose their health insurance by 2034 because of spending cuts and new eligibility rules under Medicaid. The new budget projection factors in a series of last-minute revisions that Republican leaders made to placate holdouts before the House passed the legislation last month. So, Jake, how are your sources parsing through this moment, and what do they think, from a White House perspective, the ultimate impact on senators and this legislation is going to be because of Musk?
Yeah, Ali, that's the question that is on every White House official's mind right now, is how impactful is this actually going to be to the vote? I spoke with a lot of White House officials yesterday. It's funny, they kept trying to tell me that President Trump was not taking this personally. I would then talk to other folks who said that's exactly how he's taking it. That's how he takes these types of things. Another official was telling me that this is not entirely surprising, as we've heard, because ultimately Musk was a special government employee for months and in some ways had to go along with his boss, Donald Trump, on some things. He's now getting a chance to air some of those grievances or some of those disagreements, and he's doing that from obviously his very public profile. Like, Musk is kind of the monster that Trump created. He gave him a lot of this authority and potential influence, and now he's exerting some of that. Most of the officials are telling me that they don't believe this is actually has the power. Musk's criticism doesn't have the power to sink the bill. It's not that it's not going to go through anymore. They still say they feel very confident about that. What it does, most importantly, though, is it gives some of these Republican holdouts, the Josh Hawleys and others, who already are showing some hesitancy towards supporting this bill, what it does is it gives them more and more opportunity to dig their heels in. And ultimately, it might end up having to make the White House give certain concessions to these senators that they weren't planning on doing in the first place. So it doesn't entirely sink the bill, they say, but it does frustrate them. And that's clear from some of the response yesterday.
I think that's right. I mean, it definitely shakes the turf on Capitol Hill. What I think some people on the House side were expecting to be minimal changes from the Senate, now they are bolstered in their ability to make some, and the White House may have to give them that cover because of Elon Musk. And then once again, it leaves House Republicans in the position that many of them were worried about, which is defending on the campaign trail the most, we could say, extreme version of this bill. And they're going to still have to take that back to their constituents after defending Musk and Doge for all of these months in front of angry town halls. Jake Traylor, thank you, as always, for coming on. We appreciate your reporting. A lot to cover here.